I never expected to wake up one morning and find out that my family's land, 200 acres of farmland that had belonged to us for generations, was being stolen right out from under me. But that's exactly what happened. I had barely rubbed the sleep from my eyes when my phone began buzzing relentlessly. Call after call, text after text. I frowned, seeing dozens of missed calls from Mrs. Thompson, my grandfather's next-door neighbor. Then I noticed messages from old friends, people I hadn't spoken to in years. You need to get here now. They're tearing up your land. They've got construction equipment all over your grandfather's farm. Do you know about this? My stomach sank. I immediately called Mrs. Thompson, and she picked up before the first ring had even finished. They're bulldozing your land, she cried. You need to stop them before it's too late. I sat up straight. Who? Who's doing this? It's some developer from the HOA. They put up a sign that says Pine Ridge Estates. They're clearing the trees, digging up the land. It's awful. Alex, your grandfather would be heartbroken. I felt like the wind had been knocked out of me. I hadn't even had time to process my grandfather's death yet, and now someone was trying to erase everything he had built. I didn't waste another second. I threw clothes into a bag, grabbed my truck keys, and sped out of the city. I didn't care about the 6-hour drive back home. I barely noticed the speed limit signs as I passed them. The only thing that mattered was getting back to my grandfather's land before they destroyed it completely. A nightmare in broad daylight. The road home felt both familiar and unfamiliar. I hadn't been back since my grandfather's funeral. And even then, I hadn't stayed long. The pain of losing him had been too fresh. But now, as I turned onto the dirt road leading up to the property, my chest tightened with something far worse than grief. Because in front of me was a nightmare. The rolling green fields I remembered from childhood, gone. The towering oak trees that lined the east side of the property, torn down. The red barn where my grandfather stored his tools and farm equipment, crushed under a bulldozer. And standing at the entrance of the property, like a mockery of everything that had once been here, was a massive billboard. Future site of Pine Ridge Estates. Luxury living begins here. I slammed my foot on the brakes so hard the tires skidded against the gravel. Luxury living? They wanted to turn my grandfather's farm into a gated community? I could feel the rage boiling inside me as I threw my truck into park and jumped out, marching straight toward the construction site. A sleek black SUV was parked near the entrance, and next to it stood a woman in an expensive beige blazer, clipboard in hand, surveying the chaos like she was the queen of it all. I stormed up to her. "What the hell is going on here?" She barely glanced up from her clipboard before giving me a fake, polished smile. "If you're here to inquire about purchasing a home, pre-sales begin next week." I felt my blood pressure spike. "This is my land," I snapped. "My grandfather's land, and no one gave permission for this." Now, she tilted her head, finally giving me her full attention. "Oh, you must be Mr. Walker." The way she said my name made me hate her instantly. "I'm Diane Reynolds, head of the Pine Ridge HOA, she continued smoothly. "And I'm afraid there's been some misunderstanding. This land was legally purchased by Pine Ridge Developments last year." I stared at her. "That's not possible." She sighed, flipping through the clipboard before plucking out a document. "Here," she said, handing it to me like it was nothing. "This is the signed deed. It was processed legally and the county records reflect the sale." I snatched the paper from her hands and scanned it. My grandfather's name was on it, but something was off. And then I saw the date. 3 days before he died. My hands started shaking. "He was in the hospital that day," I whispered. "He couldn't have signed this." Diane shrugged, completely unbothered. "That's not my problem," she said with an infuriating smile. "The sale was finalized. The land is ours now. And unfortunately, there's nothing you can do about it." Then she turned her back on me and started walking away. Something in me snapped. the first step in a war. I stood there for a moment, staring at the destruction, my hands clenching into tight fists. This wasn't over. I wasn't going to let them erase my family's history with a few pieces of fake paperwork. I jumped back into my truck and drove straight to the county records office. Inside, I slammed the fraudulent deed onto the front desk. "This land was never sold," I told the clerk. "The signature is fake. My grandfather was in the hospital the day this was signed. I want to see every record related to this property." The man gave me a bored look. "Sir, if you have a dispute, you'll need to take it up with the developer." I felt my fingernails digging into my palms. "I have the original property surveys. I have a handwritten letter from my grandfather. If you refuse to look into this, you're complicit." That got his attention. He sighed, rolling his chair over to the computer. "Fine." He pulled up the records, and then he went pale. "This shouldn't be possible," he muttered under his breath. I leaned forward. "What?" He turned the screen toward me. "The property was reassigned in 1994, then again in 2008, and then once more last year. Each time the ownership adjusted slightly and—" He hesitated. I gritted my teeth. "And what?" He swallowed. "And the signatures on each of these documents are identical." A cold chill ran down my spine. Diane and Pine Ridge HOA had been stealing my grandfather's land, one forged document at a time. And now? They were trying to take the rest. The weight of what I had just learned settled over me like a crushing boulder. The land hadn't just been stolen recently. It had been happening for decades. Diane and her corrupt HOA weren't just trespassers. They were thieves. And now I had the evidence. I stared at the county records on the glowing screen in front of me. The clerk, looking increasingly nervous, kept fidgeting in his seat. I don't know what to tell you," he stammered. "This is beyond my pay grade." I turned my gaze toward him, my voice like steel. "Then put me in touch with someone who can do something about it." He hesitated for a moment before sighing and motioning for me to follow. "Come with me." I followed him down a long, dimly lit hallway lined with old filing cabinets, the air thick with the scent of old paper and dust. We arrived at a door labeled County Records Director, A. Henderson. The clerk knocked once. "Mr. Henderson, there's something you need to see. The web of corruption runs deep." The man behind the desk was old, balding, and tired-looking. His office was cluttered with towers of paperwork, his desk buried under stacks of manila folders. He barely looked up as we entered. "What is it?" he grumbled. The clerk hesitated. "It's about the Walker property, the farmland outside Pine Ridge." Henderson's shoulders tensed immediately. He stopped writing, set down his pen, and finally looked up. "What about it?" I stepped forward, slapping the fraudulent deed and the property records onto his desk. "This land was never legally sold," I said. "My grandfather never signed this." His eyes flicked over the documents, and I saw something flash in them. Recognition. For a brief second, his fingers twitched, as if he was debating whether to push the papers back at me or pretend he wasn't seeing them at all. I leaned in. "You knew, didn't you?" Henderson exhaled slowly. He rubbed his face, muttering something under his breath before finally looking at me. "Son, you don't know what you're getting yourself into." My pulse quickened. "Then maybe you should tell me." Henderson tapped the fraudulent deed with one thick finger. "You're not the first person to come in here questioning this HOA, and every time the people who ask too many questions, they regret it." I crossed my arms. "I don't scare easy." His lips twisted into a humorless smile. "Then I hope you're ready for a fight. Because Diane Reynolds, she plays dirty." I already knew that much, but hearing it from him made my stomach tighten. I kept my voice steady. "Tell me everything." The HOA's long game. Henderson leaned back in his chair, studying me like he was deciding whether or not to trust me. Then finally he spoke. This land grab didn't start last year. It started 30 years ago. I stiffened. What do you mean? Henderson exhaled and gestured at the records. The Pine Ridge HOA has been slowly absorbing land for decades. Every few years, they manipulate the property lines, forge documents, pressure homeowners into selling cheap or outright steal land. I clenched my jaw. And no one stopped them? Henderson shook his head. They own the system. The county commissioner, on their payroll, the real estate developers, paid off. Even the local judge plays golf with Diane's husband every Sunday. I gritted my teeth. Diane didn't just have money. She had power. How did my grandfather hold out for so long? I asked. Henderson's lips pressed into a thin line. Because he was smart and stubborn. He kept meticulous records. He knew the original surveys by heart. And he refused to back down. That's why they had to forge the sale. He wouldn't sell, so they made it look like he did. I curled my hands into fists. My grandfather had spent his final days fighting this war alone. And now, it was my war to finish. The HOA's first strike. When I left the records office, I knew one thing for certain. I had to act fast. I pulled out my phone and immediately called my lawyer, Walter Franklin. Walter was the best damn real estate attorney in the county. And unlike Diane's corrupt network, he was clean. As soon as he picked up, I launched into everything. I need you to file an emergency injunction to stop all construction. This sale was forged, and I have proof. Walter let out a low whistle. Damn, Alex, you really stepped in at this time. I don't care, I said. Can you do it? Walter sighed. Yeah, but be ready for retaliation. These people don't go down without a fight. I had no idea just how right he was. That night, I returned to my grandfather's house. It had been standing for over a century, a symbol of my family's legacy. But the moment I pulled into the driveway, I knew something was wrong. The porch light was out, and the front door, slightly open. I froze. Had I left it open? I was certain I had locked it before I left for the records office. I reached into the truck's glove compartment, pulling out the small pistol my grandfather had always kept there. My pulse was hammering in my ears as I slowly stepped up onto the porch. I nudged the door open. Inside, the house was trashed. Drawers had been ripped open, papers scattered everywhere. Someone had torn apart my grandfather's office. My chest tightened. They were looking for something. And I had a damn good guess what. A message from Diane. Before I could react, I heard the faintest rustle outside. I spun around just in time to see the glow of headlights down the road, a black SUV, the same one Diane had been driving earlier. I ran outside just in time to see a man in a black hoodie drop something at the end of my driveway before jumping into the SUV. The tires screeched as they sped away. Heart pounding, I rushed over to see what they had left behind. A single, crisp, white envelope. I opened it with shaky hands. Inside was a printed notice from the HOA code violation notice. Immediate action required. Mr. Walker, due to violations of HOA standards, your property has been deemed unsuitable for habitation. All utilities will be disconnected within 24 hours. Failure to vacate may result in legal action. Pine Ridge HOA, I read it once, twice. And then? I laughed. It wasn't funny, not at all. But the sheer audacity of these people? They were trying to force me out of my own home, but they had no idea who they were messing with. I stuffed the letter in my pocket, turned on my heel, and marched straight back into my grandfather's office. If they wanted to play dirty, I was ready to fight filth with fire. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my grandfather's office, surrounded by his records, blueprints, maps, and every shred of evidence I had gathered. My fingers tapped restlessly against the old wooden desk as I stared at the HOA's so-called code violation notice. They thought they could scare me off my own land? They were dead wrong. By the time the sun rose, I had a plan. I picked up my phone and dialed Walter Franklin. He answered on the second ring, his voice groggy. "Alex? It's 6 in the morning. You do realize that, right?" "I do," I said, "but you need to get down here, now." Walter sighed. "This better be good." "Oh, it is," I said, glancing at the mess the intruders had left behind in my house. "Because Diane Reynolds just escalated this fight, and I'm about to end it." Walter arrived an hour later, coffee in hand, looking like he had barely brushed his hair. "All right," he said, stepping into the office and scanning the disaster around him. "I can already tell this isn't going to be a good morning." I dropped the HOA's violation notice on the table in front of him. "They're trying to push me off my own land with fake fines, utility shutoffs, and break-ins." Walter read the letter, his eyebrows rising. "They don't have the legal right to cut off your utilities. They'd need a city order for that." "I don't think they care about legal," I muttered. "But I need to go on the offensive. Do we have enough to sue them right now?" Walter sighed, rubbing his temples. "Yes and no. Yes, we have enough to argue that the land sale was fraudulent, but if we take this to court, it'll be months before we get a hearing. Diane will use that time to bury evidence, intimidate witnesses, and make your life hell." "Then we hit her where it hurts," I said. "Her reputation." Walter smirked. "I like the way you think." I pulled out a thick folder. "This is everything I've collected from the other homeowners. People she's fined, harassed, even forced out of their homes. We're not just fighting for my land. We're taking down the entire corrupt HOA." Walter flipped through the pages, whistling. Damn, Alex, this is a class action lawsuit waiting to happen." "Exactly," I said, "but we need more." Walter leaned forward. "What are you thinking?" I took a deep breath. "I need to break into the HOA's office." Walter choked on his coffee. "You what?" "I'm serious," I said. "There are financial records, contracts, and documents in that office proving fraud, and you know damn well Diane will burn them the second she realizes what we're doing." Walter pinched the bridge of his nose. "This is a terrible idea. Do you have a better one?" He exhaled sharply. "Fine. But if you get caught, I don't know you." That night, I drove into Pine Ridge Estates, my headlights off. The HOA office was a small, pristine white building at the end of a cul-de-sac, nestled between a manicured park and the community pool. Diane, in her infinite arrogance, didn't believe anyone would ever challenge her. There were no security cameras, just a single lock on the office door. I picked it easily. The office was exactly what I expected, modern, spotless, and cold. Framed photos of Diane and other board members hung on the walls, each one grinning like royalty. I didn't waste time. I started rifling through drawers, pulling out files, scanning paperwork, and snapping photos with my phone. Then I found it. A ledger, a thick, leather-bound book hidden at the bottom of a filing cabinet. I flipped through the pages, my pulse pounding. $200,000 in community maintenance fees, no work ever done. Special assessments collected from homeowners. Half of it vanished. Fraudulent contracts awarded to companies owned by Diane's family. This was it. The smoking gun. I shoved the ledger into my bag and turned to leave, but then I heard footsteps outside. My stomach dropped. A key rattled in the front door. I had seconds to react. I ducked behind the reception desk just as the door swung open. A voice. Diane. "I don't care what it costs," she hissed into her phone. "I want him out. Find me a way to evict him, legally or not." I gritted my teeth. So this was personal now. She shuffled through some papers on the desk, still muttering into the phone. I held my breath, willing myself to be invisible. After what felt like an eternity, She grabbed her purse and slammed the door shut behind her. I waited until her footsteps faded before bolting for my truck. I had what I needed. Now, it was time to bring Diane down. The next morning, Walter and I sat in a local diner, spreading the stolen HOA documents across the table. "This is gold," Walter muttered. "Absolute gold. This woman has been committing fraud for years." I nodded. "We need to make sure everyone sees this." Walter smirked. "I know just the guy." By noon, the local news was all over it. The Pine Ridge HOA's finances were a front-page scandal. A local journalist, Tanya Lewis, ran the story of the decade, exposing Diane's embezzlement, fraud, and illegal land acquisitions. The backlash was instant. Residents of Pine Ridge Estates, the same people Diane had terrorized for years, stormed the HOA offices. They demanded answers, refunds, resignations, and Diane, she ran. By the time authorities issued an arrest warrant, she had already disappeared. But it was too late. The HOA was finished. The community, finally free. And my land, mine again. A month later, I stood on my grandfather's porch looking out at the rolling green fields that had belonged to my family for generations. No construction, no bulldozers, just peace. Walter walked up beside me, grinning. "So what's next?" I smirked. "Well, I was thinking we turn this land into something the HOA would have hated." Walter raised an eyebrow. "Like what?" "A community farm. Open to everyone." He chuckled. "Diane would die if she heard that." I nodded. "Good. Because this land was no longer about revenge. It was about legacy. My grandfather's fight was finally over, and I had won." The news spread like wildfire. By morning, every major local network was covering the HOA corruption scandal. Residents who had once feared Diane Reynolds were now furious, demanding answers, refunds, and in some cases reparations for the thousands of dollars stolen from them over the years. Pine Ridge Estates was in chaos, and Diane, she was nowhere to be found. I sat in my grandfather's old rocking chair, flipping through news articles on my phone as I sipped my coffee. Local HOA president under investigation for fraud. Homeowners demand answers as HOA scandal unfolds. Evictions, fraud, and a missing president. What's next for Pine Ridge? Every headline made me grin. I glanced up as Walter pulled into my driveway, stepping out with a satisfied smirk. "Guess who just resigned from the HOA board?" I raised an eyebrow. "Gerald?" Walter nodded, tossing a thick folder onto my table. "Not just him. The entire board quit this morning. Nobody wants to be caught in Diane's mess." I picked up the folder, flipping through resignation letters, legal filings, and a petition signed by over 100 homeowners demanding the dissolution of the HOA. "They're giving up?" I asked. Walter chuckled. "No, Alex. They're surrendering." I leaned back, letting the weight of it sink in. The very system that had stolen my grandfather's land and terrorized homeowners for years was falling apart before my eyes. And yet, something didn't feel right. Diane had disappeared too easily. That afternoon, I drove into town to meet Tanya Lewis, the journalist who had published the exposé on Diane's corruption. She was waiting for me at a small diner, flipping through her notes as I slid into the booth across from her. "I was wondering when I'd hear from you," she said, setting her notepad down. "Figured you'd want to talk after what happened last night." I frowned. "What happened?" She hesitated, then pulled out her phone. "Look at this." I leaned in as she played security footage from Pine Ridge Estates. The timestamp read 3:47 a.m. The camera angle was shaky, but I could see a group of men in dark clothing sneaking into the HOA office. They ransacked the place, tore apart file cabinets, computers, everything. Then, as quickly as they arrived, they were gone. "They wiped everything," Tanya said grimly. "Hard drives, financial records, Even security footage from the last 2 weeks. If I hadn't saved this clip before the servers crashed, we wouldn't even know they were there. My blood ran cold. This wasn't over. Any idea who they were? I asked. Tanya shook her head. Could be Diane's people, could be someone bigger. Whatever it is, they're covering tracks. I clenched my fists. Of course Diane had backup. She hadn't just been some HOA president on a power trip. She had connections, dangerous ones. What's your next move? Tanya asked. I exhaled slowly. I'm going to find Diane. Walter wasn't thrilled when I told him my plan. This is insane, he said, pacing in my living room. We should be celebrating, not chasing after a woman who is clearly dangerous. She's still pulling the strings, I argued. She ran, but she's not gone. If we don't find her, she'll come back, and she'll be smarter next time. Walter groaned. Fine. Where do we start? I pulled out Diane's financial records, the ones I had stolen from the HOA office before she disappeared. Most of it was standard fraud. Inflated expenses, fake invoices, missing HOA funds. But one detail stood out. A series of payments to a law firm in another state. Walter leaned in, scanning the paperwork. Why would she need out-of-state lawyers? I smirked. Because she's hiding. We tracked the law firm to a small town 3 hours away. It was a quiet, picturesque place, the kind of place Diane would run to while she waited for things to settle down. Walter and I staked out the law firm's office, watching for hours. And then, around 8 p.m., she walked in, Diane Reynolds, dressed in expensive casual wear, her hair perfectly styled like nothing had happened. She wasn't a fugitive. She was planning something. We need to flush her out, Walter whispered. I nodded, gripping the steering wheel. It was time to turn the tables. The next morning, I walked straight into the law firm. A receptionist greeted me with a fake smile. Do you have an appointment? I leaned in, dropping a stack of fraudulent HOA documents on her desk. Tell Diane Reynolds that Alex Walker is here. The receptionist visibly tensed. She's unavailable, I grinned. Oh, I think she'll make time. A long silence. Then, a door at the end of the hall swung open. Diane stepped out, her face calm but her eyes full of rage. Alex, she said, forcing a smile, I was wondering when you'd show up. I folded my arms. We need to talk. She sighed. Fine. 5 minutes. She led me into a conference room, closing the door behind us. What do you want? She asked, her voice cold. I slid the stolen HOA financial records across the table. I want you to admit what you did, I said, and I want you to return every stolen dollar. Diane laughed. Actually laughed. You still don't get it, do you? She sneered. You think this is over? I narrowed my eyes. I know it's not. That's why I'm here. Diane leaned in. Let me explain how this works. You won the battle, Alex. But the war? The war isn't fought in town meetings and newspaper headlines. She smirked. It's fought in lawsuits. It's fought in zoning permits and tax codes. And guess what? She tapped her nails against the table. I still have friends in very high places. I clenched my fists. So that's your plan? Hide behind lawyers? Diane shrugged. It's always worked before. I smiled. Not this time. She frowned. What? I pulled out my phone, tapped the screen, and played an audio recording. Her entire confession. Diane's face drained of color. You! I stood up. You just lost the war. I walked out of the conference room as Diane snapped, screaming at her lawyers. By the time Walter and I left town, Diane's story was already leaking to the press. She wasn't just going to lose her stolen fortune. She was going to prison. 3 weeks later, I stood in my grandfather's fields, watching the land return to what it was always meant to be. Free. Walter joined me, arms crossed. So, is it over? I exhaled. Almost. Walter smirked. What's left? I glanced toward the town, making sure no one ever tries this again. Because Pine Ridge Estates had fallen. But corruption? That could always come back, and I'd be ready when it did. Diane Reynolds had finally lost. Her reputation was ruined, her influence destroyed, and her legal troubles had just begun. The moment the audio of her confession leaked, it spread like wildfire, on the news, in HOA forums, even on national legal talk shows, dissecting the corruption that had gone unchecked for years. By the time Diane's arrest warrant was issued for fraud, embezzlement, and property theft, she had already gone into hiding, but I knew exactly where she was. She wasn't as unpredictable as she thought. She ran to the one place she believed was untouchable, her vacation home. Walter and I drove out to the gated lakeside community where Diane had her secondary home, a lavish estate she had purchased entirely with stolen HOA funds. We weren't alone. Half the town had followed us. A caravan of homeowners, former HOA victims, and local reporters lined the streets as we approached the entrance. Walter pulled the car to a stop, watching as the security guards blocked the entrance. "Private property," one of them said gruffly. I smiled. "I'm not here to trespass." I turned, signaling the news cameras behind me. "I just want to have a friendly conversation." The guards hesitated. They knew who I was. Before they could argue, the front doors of Diane's house flew open. There she stood, Diane Reynolds. Her once perfectly put-together appearance was disheveled, her designer clothes wrinkled, her expression one of pure rage and exhaustion. She stormed down the steps, marching straight toward me. "This is harassment!" she shrieked. "I will have every single one of you arrested." Walter chuckled. "You might want to check the news, Diane." I held up my phone, showing the live broadcast of her arrest warrant being issued. Diane's face went white. She turned to run, but the moment she did, a sheriff's car pulled up behind her. 2 deputies stepped out. "Diane Reynolds?" one of them called. She stopped in her tracks. "You're under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit property theft." Diane spun back to me, her eyes burning with hatred. "You think you won?" she spat. "You have no idea how deep this goes." I folded my arms. "Neither do you." She opened her mouth to scream, but the officers had already grabbed her. As they placed her in handcuffs, I leaned in and whispered, "Enjoy your HOA prison cell." She lunged at me, but the deputies dragged her away. The crowd erupted into cheers as Diane Reynolds was driven away, her empire crumbling behind her. Over the next few months, Pine Ridge Estates underwent a massive transformation. The HOA was completely dismantled. Every corrupt policy, every unjust fine, every ridiculous regulation wiped from existence. And the best part? The people took back control. We held a town hall meeting where the remaining homeowners had a choice: rebuild with fairness or dissolve the HOA entirely. The vote was unanimous: no more HOA. For the first time in decades, Pine Ridge was a free community again. 1 year later, I stood at the very place this battle had begun, my grandfather's land, the land Diane and her corrupt HOA tried to steal. Now it was something greater than it had ever been. We turned it into a community park, honoring my grandfather's legacy. Families played in the open fields, children ran freely, and for the first time in years, the town felt like home again. Walter joined me, handing me a fresh coffee. "So," he said, taking a sip, "what's next?" I smirked. "There's another town about 40 miles from here," I said. "They've got an HOA president with a god complex." Walter laughed. "You're serious?" I nodded. Diane had been the first, but she wasn't the last. HOAs across the country had gotten too powerful, too greedy, too corrupt. And now, it was time for someone to hold them accountable. Walter shook his head with a grin. "You're really going to war with HOAs, huh?" I smiled. "No." I took one last look at my grandfather's land that was finally truly free. "I'm just getting started."